Disclaimer. This video contains very brief moments of mildly flashing lights, so if you are particularly photosensitive, I do recommend just listening to this one. Furthermore, this video contains spoilers for Still Wakes the Deep, Luto, Silent Hill 2, Resident Evil 2, Signalis, SOMA, Amnesia the Bunker, Visage, Confabulation, and The Midnight Walk. Time codes for all of these spoilers should be on screen right now, with the red time codes representing major spoilers, which are also represented in the chapters section, while time codes written in white represent minor spoilers, for which this is your only warning. So, with all that being said, please enjoy the video. Imagine, if you will, you're playing a certain horror game. Something you've played before, but try to think back to the first time. Picture a moment, probably quite early on in the game, where you're making your way through a dimly lit area as the ambiance seems to come to a fever pitch, and a sound alerts you to the presence of the first tangible threat the game has presented, just up ahead. What are your options? Can you confront the threat in any way, or do you have to avoid it at all costs? How scared are you? Imagine a different game. Same scenario, but if you could fight back before, think of a game where you couldn't, and if you couldn't fight back before, think of a game where you could. Same scenario. How scared are you? And how much did the ability to confront the threat change your answer? It's almost Halloween, and for the better part of the past year, every Monday for about 6 hours, I've been playing horror games, trying to determine whether the addition of combat as a mechanic makes these games inherently more or less frightening. And I've been playing horror games, been consuming horror media for most of my life, and as a result I've been quite desensitized to the more subjective elements of the genre. But with the games themselves, regarding their mechanics, I find there's still a great deal of potential for that adrenaline rush sort of fear that I'm looking for from these experiences. And I've always taken for granted that passive horror, that is, horror where you cannot defend yourself, is going to be inherently scarier than aggressive horror where you can defend yourself. But after the past year of experience with these games and the research I've been doing in the background, I've arrived at the conclusion that, with the exception of walking sims, which have their own merits and flaws I'd like to touch on in this video as well, any decent horror game is composed of a series of threats with multiple methods of resolution which the player must weigh against each other. Other mechanics like puzzles and button mashing may be present, but it is these threats that are the primary source of fear, and the intensity of that fear, while subjectively contingent on many factors that fall outside of the scope of this video, is objectively contingent on the ambiguity surrounding which method of threat resolution offers the most favorable cost-to-benefit ratio. That is to say, these games, on a mechanical level, instill fear by making the player doubt the way they're going about getting around or subduing a threat. The question is, does the addition of combat as a potential method of threat resolution improve or detract from this ambiguity? The answer is not satisfying. Sorry. The first major difference that I want to explore between these subgenres is the inherently different mindset that you're going to have going into aggressive versus passive horror. Even if you're going in blind, you're going to catch on pretty quickly to the fact that there is or is not combat. And the effect that this has impacts your level of immersion, it impacts the clarity of the threats you perceive, and it impacts your response to those threats when you perceive them. And the first main point I want to make regarding the difference in mindset is that in aggressive horror, you are a significantly more active participant in the horror itself. The consequences for getting caught by an enemy in aggressive horror is to fight rather than just die. Of course, there are passive horror games, plenty of passive horror games, where one hit won't kill you, it'll take off like half your health. But either way, in aggressive horror, you are spending a lot more time directly confronting the horrifying threats. You're lining up headshots on these scary things that the devs have modeled for the game. And in addition to just spending a lot more time looking right at the scary thing, you're sinking into the protagonist's shoes with much more ease. You are managing their inventory, you're managing their ammo, you're lining up shots for them, you're healing them after combat, and this makes it much easier to blur the line between the player and the protagonist, to immerse the player. And that immersion is a fundamental prerequisite for fear. If you don't feel any sort of connection between you and the protagonist, why should you be afraid of the things that they are afraid of? And of course, a foundation of tension is also very important. We're going to talk about how mechanics can influence tension in the next section, but broadly speaking, tension building is a very subjective thing that falls outside of the scope of this video. So mechanically, all these games can really do is help immerse the player, and the fact is, aggressive horror is better at doing that. It has an easier time, maybe not an easier, it's more of a straightforward process, immersing the player when there's this whole combat system to sink into. And conversely, in passive horror, immersion is a lot more elusive. There's fewer mechanics to engage with, and you engage with the horror itself less. You're actively avoiding the scary things in passive horror. And as a result, there are good things, of course, that mindset can do, but you do have a much harder time immersing the player when they are controlling the protagonist's actions so much less. A lot of passive horror achieves immersion through a compelling story. And that's great. That's a big part of the reason why when these games blow up, they're very highly regarded because, well, you have to tell a really good story to immerse the player. The trouble is, if you fail to tell a good story, you've effectively cut yourself off from immersion in general. Because if the player's laughing at the writing the entire time, they're never really going to get scared, and it takes a lot to overcome that. Now, it's not always the case that it's a bad story that makes it hard for the player to get immersed. A big part of the issue is that it's kind of inherent to the wider horror genre, horror gaming genre, that is, that the threats are generally going to be quite obvious. This isn't such a big deal in aggressive horror because there's still tension when you know there's an enemy in the room with you, because you don't know how that fight is going to go. But in passive horror, knowing that you're in danger, knowing that there is a threat nearby, really eliminates a lot of the fear to be had from that threat. And like I said, it's a problem with the genre as a whole, but passive horror in particular, and I think it's because devs don't want to frustrate players by giving them unexpected things in a game where they can't defend themselves, but they tend to telegraph enemies way ahead of time. Still Wakes the Deep, in particular, has a really bad habit of putting the maps of the zones where enemies are going to be shortly before the zone themselves. I guess this is just to give you a preview of the area you're about to go in. Yeah, I suppose. So there's almost certainly going to be a monster here. So whenever you see a map that very explicitly details what the next area is going to look like, you catch on pretty quick to the fact that, oh, that means there's going to be an enemy in the next area that I have to navigate around, and suddenly a lot of that tension is gone. Devs really miss out by doing that on the opportunity to put the player in that panic state where they have to quickly make a decision as to how they're going to deal with this enemy. Instead, the player has been priming themselves for a minute or two while they go into that area. Walking simulators suffer from a similar issue. Ludo in particular, you recognize within the first minute that the protagonist walks way too slow for any non-scripted threats to ever reasonably be implemented. So you know going into Ludo and most walking simulators that this is a walking simulator. There's not going to be a whole lot of ambiguity surrounding what you need to do should a threat present itself. And as a result, immersion is either very limited in passive horror, or it requires that the game make you forget that safety, forget how obvious it's going to be when you are actually in danger. And that takes a lot of work. However, if they achieve that, I argue that passive horror, when you are immersed, is significantly scarier than aggressive horror when you are immersed. And most of that, of course, is because confrontation in general is scarier when you can't defend yourself. Ludo and Visage, both some of my scariest horror experiences to date, despite the fact that I kind of knew, especially on Ludo going in, it was always going to be a scripted threat. But they made me forget that, and as a result, I'm never going to forget how scared I was during certain moments in Ludo. And Visage is a similar story, though. Visage does have the haunting mechanic that you have to keep at bay with medication, and that those are technically unscripted threats, but they're few and far between, and they're easy to avoid. But still, it's a very scary game, in my opinion, despite the fact that it had to work a lot harder to immerse me. When it got there, it was a lot scarier. And methods for threat resolution as well require a lot more commitment in passive horror. There's a lot of contingencies that you have in aggressive horror. If you fail to escape an enemy, you can fight. You can shoot it a few times. There's still tension there, of course, but that initial commitment to plan A, you know that there can be a plan B, which is so much more rarely the case in passive horror. When you jump out of that locker to make a break for the exit, you better keep running until you're safe, or the protagonist is going to die. The trouble, of course, is that as soon as the protagonist dies, you very quickly get a sense of how limited your agency is, because rather than having a fight happen when you get caught, it's immediately back to the checkpoint. The consequences are immediately established, and there's not really any wiggle room in those consequences. This is the issue, though. Like, with games like this, I've already made this point in other notes, but you really get desensitized really fast, since there's no tension between being seen and dying, really. I mean, I guess there kind of is if you're running, but you can get pretty used to just dying over and over again, and very quickly all the tension is gone. Aggressive horror, you might get away from a fight with it by using a single bullet, or you might have to use way more ammo than you wanted, and you might have to heal after. But in passive horror, you get caught and it's immediately obvious, okay, so if that happens, I gotta go turn that valve again and then make my way to the other one without getting caught, sort of deal. And it becomes no longer about the protagonist's death, but instead about the player's inconvenience. And this likely explains the existence of walking simulators in general. When all of the threats are scripted, you're going to have a harder time getting desensitized to a scripted threat, because realistically, that scripted threat only happened once, and you kept going afterwards. It makes perhaps for a less engaging experience, but it can be a scarier experience, and it can certainly be a less frustrating experience. Now, this sort of desensitization, does happen in aggressive horror as well, in a sort of different way. Because resource management is often at the forefront of these games, you very quickly train the player to avoid combat wherever they can, and this tends to result in many areas in aggressive horror games with enemies that you consistently slip by. What comes to mind for me first is the bottom floor of the library in the Resident Evil 2's remake, where it starts out with 3 zombies in that room. If you kill one and you don't lure any more in there, or if you do lure any more in there, you take them out as well, you can slip by the remaining 2 zombies for the rest of the game without issue. Whether or not Mr. X is in the room, you're good. And this is a room that you go through very frequently in the first like half of Resident Evil 2's remake. And as a result, you very quickly get desensitized not just to those two zombies in that room, but to all of the zombies in the game. And they're pretty much the main enemy you're going to be dealing with for the first half of the game, if not a little bit further. And so you get desensitized, and suddenly all these enemies can do is frustrate you. It's not about being scared anymore. You're so used to slipping right by them, it's hard to be scared of them. And this brings me to one of the external sources that I want to be coming back to frequently throughout this video. In 2019, Thomas Grip, the creative director at Frictional, the people who did Amnesia, not Nocturnal, Penumbra, and SOMA, he wrote a blog post on Frictional's website called 9 Years, 9 Lessons on Horror, where he discussed the lessons that he learned about developing horror games in his time with Frictional. And he says, players will try to optimize the feeling of being scared away, often unconsciously. In the end, the players will ruin the intended experience for themselves, and the crazy thing is that players complain when this happens. They probe the system for flaws and choose to exploit them, yet want the enemies to remain scary. And he, at the time, was talking about Penumbra, one of the early games where the dog enemies, all you really had to do to neutralize them as a threat was get on top of a box, and they weren't a problem. But this is a much bigger issue in aggressive horror because of the way you tend to... The resource management system makes you a lot more likely to try to optimize your way around enemies and then desensitize yourself to them. He goes on to say, it is quite common in games to make sure the player understands the systems in place as clearly as possible. This often results in some really daunting tutorials. Of course, for some games, like fighting games, it's important to have in-depth knowledge about the systems to be able to optimize the game. In horror games, we actually want the opposite. And this is a very good thing to keep in mind, especially for passive horror. Clearly, the people at Amnesia kept that in mind to this day. But aggressive horror devs, I think, tend to forget that, and you end up in a situation with aggressive horror on a mindset level where it feels like the devs think there isn't a difference between stress and fear. And the ability to fight these threats often codifies them in such a way that it disambiguates the threat itself, and suddenly, just like how when you're so consistently able to slip by zombies, they can only frustrate you rather than scare you. Once you've codified most of the threats in the game, they can only serve to stress you out. Tension building tends to only serve to stress you out when you know the best way to deal with an enemy. And you're going to figure out the best way to deal with an enemy, or at least the ambiguity surrounding how to deal with enemies doesn't last as long, I think, in most aggressive horror. Of course, to be fair to Resident Evil 2, there does seem to be a little bit of RNG in how many bullets it takes to take out a zombie, but you do still pretty quickly get a ballpark sense of it and pretty quickly establish, yeah, if you can avoid combat, you're better off. And that is something that happens a lot in all aggressive horror. So with a clear goal, tension really only breeds stress. Another really interesting sort of mirrored situation in aggressive versus passive horror that I think serves as a really good capstone to this section on the difference in mindset is there's a very similar situation in Luto and in Silent Hill. In Luto, there is a hangman puzzle towards the end of the game. You just have to put the right letters. You have, I don't know, like 5 or 6 attempts to get it right, and you're in this room where there are corridors all around that you've been through, and as you're solving the puzzle, you start to hear footsteps in the hallways outside you. Okay, guys. Okay, yeah, alright, that's very good. And I found those footsteps distinctly unnerving. The game had done a really good job up to that point, laying a foundation of tension. It helped to make me forget that all of the threats were going to be scripted, and in that moment, I was scared. Conversely, Silent Hill 2, both the remake and the original, have in the prison section, there's a courtyard that you go back to a few times throughout the prison section, where, ironically, I'm pretty sure there's some kind of hangman-related puzzle. There's a noose-oriented puzzle in that courtyard. And when you're in that courtyard, anytime you're in that courtyard as James, just out of view, somewhere where that pitch inky blackness kind of comes in, there's this recurring sort of scuffling footsteps that you hear. Just out of view. I'm pretty sure there's never any actual threat there. Maybe there's some kind of Easter egg you can discover if you walk around there long enough or something, but in my experience, there was never actually a threat. Just like how in Ludo, there was never actually a threat. I don't know if I have to go find a bunch of ropes or what. Can we get this fight over with? The tension isn't there. I just want you to reveal yourself so I can remove the threat from the yard. The difference is, I don't think you can do that as effectively in an aggressive horror game, because as James, compared to as Samuel in Ludo, I am in a threat-seeking mode. Because I can dispatch threats as James, I at the very least want to know where they are. So when threats are inherently ambiguous and just there to put me on edge, it's just going to annoy me. It's not really going to scare me the way that the almost identical situation in Ludo did. Continuing from Thomas Cripp's article, a vague and uncertain game system is like a creepy photo. You can make out enough to get an idea of what's going on, but there's still room for the imagination to go wild. Let's use the health meter in Resident Evil as an example. Internally, it is an analog property, a decimal number from 0 to some value, but the player will only ever know that it has 3 states. This strikes a great balance between giving information and being vague, and helps crank up the tension. It's interesting to see him reference something from Resident Evil, which, in my opinion, with the exception of 7, of Village and Biohazard, they were mostly not scary for most of their run. I know it was different way back in the day. There wasn't as much out there, but it's interesting to see Thomas Grip, the frictional guy, the amnesia guy, giving praise to Resident Evil's health bar system, which is very indicative of exactly the sort of vagueness you want in a horror game. Give the player an indication of the game's mechanics, but don't make it explicit. And aggressive horror has a tendency to make mechanics explicit, either immediately or eventually as a process of familiarizing yourself with the game. So, now that we've talked about how your mindset is inherently different going into a passive horror game versus an aggressive horror game, I want to touch on what ultimately makes up the bulk of the points I have to make in this video, which is how the mechanics influence that horror in one genre versus the other. And, of course, when I was approaching this trying to be as objective as I could in such a subjective subject, it really was important that I primarily examined the mechanics, because those are the sort of thing that you can look at objectively, even if maybe it's always going to be subjective whether or not a certain mechanic makes a game scarier. But the reality is that the existence of combat, or lack thereof, is going to necessarily change the way you interact with the game. It's also going to inform other mechanics for better or worse. And the first thing I want to talk about is how in passive horror, the mechanics tend to be pretty foolproof. People aren't expecting as much of a horror game where combat isn't an option. And this results in, generally, simpler mechanics, which means fewer distractions from the horror should a glitch happen or a mechanic be poorly implemented. And if immersion is achieved, because there are fewer distractions from the horror, there's fewer ways to jeopardize the immersion that these passive horror games have to work so hard to create. However, walking simulators, they have less replay value, which doesn't make them inherently less scary. In fact, I personally don't really replay most horror games that I play, no matter how fun they were, because I play these games to be scared, and it's hard to be scared on a second playthrough. But As a result of less replay value, a lot of passive horror games really don't like to be just walking simulators, and they tend to add more mechanics on top of it, even if those mechanics aren't inherently combative. Sometimes this results in really innovative gameplay. To go back to that Thomas Grip article, he says, the sanity system in Amnesia: The Dark Descent is similarly vague. You know, scary things, whatever these are, lower your sanity, and bad things, whatever those are, will happen if it drops too low, so you don't want to risk it. And the sanity system is a very good example of innovative gameplay that arose from devs not wanting to make a walking simulator. And of course, the vagueness of that system is great, but just the idea in general that you can't look at the scary things or your character will suffer consequences is fantastic. You want to kind of make it so the player doesn't want to look at the scary things. It's an inherent flaw that aggressive horror has. You have to look at the scary things. You have to line up headshots on the scary things. And I just thought it was worth mentioning the sanity system in Amnesia. It's also worth mentioning Spot the Difference games as a whole. They're not exactly super popular, but they have noteworthy popularity within their communities, and they can result in very innovative gameplay. Confabulation is a Spot the Difference kind of game that I played in the process of researching this video, and it has a sanity system that does a good job of immersing the player into the protagonist's shoes, because your sanity is inherently linked to spotting the differences, because the protagonist in Confabulation is a paranoid schizophrenic who is under the impression that there are people in their house moving their things around. I don't quite remember whether or not it was actually the case, whether or not anything actually supernatural was happening. And to be clear, it's not the most sensitive depiction of paranoid schizophrenia, but it does a pretty good job of immersing you into the protagonist's shoes very early on. The Midnight Walk also, which is a very cool game, more people should play. It's largely composed of stop motion assets, actual claymation assets that they animated in a stop motion style, if not actually took full 360 pictures for each frame of the animation. I'm not entirely sure how they did it, but it's a really cool game. You should check it out. It has an eye closing mechanic. It was made initially for virtual reality, so I imagine the idea, if you have a VR headset, is that you literally close your eyes to initiate this. But it's almost, at least, I can't say for sure that it's just as effective, but it's very effective on just a monitor as well. You just press a button to close your eyes instead of literally closing your eyes. And it's used in a lot of different ways, but there's one particular enemy in the Midnight Walk that you have to, it's sort of a gargoyle situation where it's petrified. You close your eyes in front of it and it comes to life, or vice versa. And what ends up happening with these enemies is you kind of create your own chase sequences. There are puzzles you need to solve by moving them to one place and then moving them, aggroing them so you can get to another. And we're going to talk more about chase sequences in the next section, but this is exactly, I think, how you should do chase sequences, where the player creates the chase sequence, rather than just bumbling into an enemy and having to run away, which is still a really good way to do these, for lack of a better word, diegetic chase sequences. Midnight Walk has you literally setting up the parameters for that chase sequence and thinking ahead of time, like, oh god, I'm gonna have to run away from this thing when I reanimate it. And it's beautiful. It really, and the fact that the Midnight Walk likely came up with this mechanic as a way to avoid being a walking simulator is just indicative of how sometimes that desire can lead to really good things. Sometimes it leads to very unnecessary, tacked on, annoyingly abstract mechanics. Ludo, which I've said before is a walking simulator, has this really unnecessary section towards the end of the game where you are effectively playing 3D Pac-Man in this kind of retro styled section of the game. It's like a hospital. It's all very symbolic. I won't spoil the symbolism. but you're running away from spiders who can actually hurt you. For the first time in this whole game, you have unscripted threats that can send you back to a checkpoint, and it's ultimately just really annoying. There's a brief moment where you're kind of on edge because this is all very new and unexpected. The game really does just drop you into this, but it kind of sucks. I didn't like it at all. It really took me out of it, and it was an abrupt sort of halt to the storytelling that I think the game would have been better off without. Still Wakes the Deep has a button mashing mechanic that you use to platform around the oil rig that the game takes place on, and I get what they were going for. You know, when you have to mash buttons to have the protagonist climb up something that they almost fell from, you're kind of trying to blur the line between the player and the protagonist, but not really. I mean, that's what they're trying to do, sure, but it's mostly just forced abstraction that I think the game would have been better off without. It feels more of a source of distraction than immersion, though that might be more of a subjective take. The reality is, it's better to be a walking sim than have a poorly implemented, a poorly executed mechanic, in my opinion. Walking sims can still be very scary if you're willing to put a lot of effort into the more subjective elements to get the player immersed and feeling that strong degree of tension. Aggressive horror does this less often, though it is worth talking about Resident Evil 2. I don't know if this is in the original, but in the remake, the signal modulator. I don't take issue with the signal modulator itself. I think it's kind of cool that it's basically a key with multiple locks that you have to carry around with you at certain periods towards the end of the game. What I don't like is that it comes with a mini game. I'm sure this has been covered better by other people in the past, but the mini game feels really unnecessary. It grinds the tension to a halt, and the game would have been better without it. It could have just been you plug the signal modulator into the panel and you're good. If you have the key, why do I have to then go through an unnecessary mini game? But like I said, aggressive horror does this a lot less frequently. Now, it is worth noting, aggressive horror inherently has a mechanic that can go wrong. Combat systems can go wrong, of course. They can go just as wrong as any other mechanic, and as a result, there is more room for error in an aggressive horror game. It's the opposite of passive horror games tending to benefit from a simpler mechanical system. Aggressive horror games have to make sure that that combat system is tight, right? They have to make sure that the combat system goes well, that it works properly. Because if it's not, it's a huge distraction, and suddenly the main way that you interact with the game is mostly frustrating. Or at the very least, just not fun. Good horror combat, in my opinion, is weighty, diverse, as in a wide variety of enemies that you actually fight. It's fluid, and it is scarce. I think the best thing, and we're going to talk about this towards the end of the video more explicitly, the best thing that a combat system in a horror game can be is used scarcely. Because if you're fighting your way through every encounter, if you get to this point where you really prefer to fight your enemies, you're not really playing a horror game anymore. You're playing a horror-themed action game. Failing to meet these criteria very much hinders immersion. Now, regarding resource management. Resource management does, of course, appear in passive horror, though much less frequently, because in passive horror, you don't have to worry about ammo. You don't have to worry about weapons. You don't usually have to worry about health. That's not the case in aggressive horror. And so, the resource management systems, when they exist in aggressive horror compared to passive horror, tend to leave a lot more potential for ambiguity, tends to give the player a lot more questions, a lot more things to doubt. Am I bringing enough ammo into this section? And do I have enough health? Is there going to be more health up ahead because I really need it? This is really, really good for tension building, and it's something that passive horror doesn't often get the opportunity to do to such good effect. Post-desensitization, once you've gotten over your fear of the actual threats in an aggressive horror game, resource management is going to be the primary reason why you are still kind of afraid subconsciously of combat. You don't want to get into these combat encounters because you don't want to use the bullets. And while, of course, that can lead to further desensitization by getting in this, like I talked about earlier, frequently getting into close proximity with enemies without consequence, it does still make you, if you see a horde of zombies in Resident Evil 2 and you've got like a clip in your pistol, you are going to be scared of those zombies, whether or not you've gotten subjectively desensitized to the models. In combat, the desire to conserve resource does drive that tension. So even when you are actually in a fight, the tension is being upheld by the fact that every time you fire your gun, that's one fewer bullet you're going to have for later in the game. Now, aggressive horror also tends mechanically to have much more ambiguous solutions. Just the fact that combat is an option, if it's implemented well, it's just one more thing you could potentially do. It's one more alternative to whatever you happen to be doing. It's one more thing to wonder, would this be a better approach than what I'm doing right now? And that doubt, like we've been talking about, is very important for scaring the player. Resident Evil 2 specifically seems to randomize ammo requirements for zombie kills. We talked about that earlier, but it also, certain enemies, particularly the lickers in Resident Evil 2, they have very ambiguous aggression parameters. It's not made very clear until you've accidentally done it a few too many times what it actually takes to aggro the lickers in Resident Evil 2. The only note you find in game that comes close to disambiguating this is, so long as you don't run around like a total idiot, guns a-blazing, you should be able to slip right by them. Probably. And so whenever you encounter a licker, it's always a tense situation until you get to the point where you recognize, okay, I can get this close, and as long as they don't make any noise or run in the room that they're in, they won't aggro and I'll be fine. But it's very easy to accidentally aggro those lickers, and that is genuinely one of the scariest moments you'll find in the Resident Evil 2 remake. So when you do that on accident, and suddenly there's this fight that you are not prepared for. Most of Signalis' scares are unexpected enemy spawns. It's this sort of thing that passive horror tends to fail to do, where you're suddenly in that panicked moment where you need to make a decision. Do I run out of this room immediately, or do I actually fight these enemies? This is really interesting. Signalis' radio mechanic for fighting a certain enemy type called a Colibri is super chaotic. You step into a room with one of these enemies and suddenly your screen is glitching, and there's occasionally radio frequencies that the goal is to tune into those radio frequencies to create a feedback loop to damage the Colibri. But it is a chaotic, ambiguous situation, and it's not made clear at all how you're meant to deal with these enemies. And it makes for easily, in my opinion, the scariest moments in these games, when you have no idea what to do with this new enemy. And this is sort of indicative of how combat can create these very ambiguous situations, where not only do you not know how to deal with this situation, you don't even know what your options are. And it's something that passive horror is going to struggle to achieve in the same way. The last point that I want to make regarding how mechanics can contribute or detract from the ambiguity in these games is that I am of the opinion that boss fights are fundamentally unscary. They are either resource sinks or gimmicks to learn. And in the case of gimmicks to learn, I don't think any gimmicky boss fight is ever going to be fun. I'm of the opinion that they are exclusively frustrating, because even once you learn what the gimmick is, the next hurdle is pulling it off the way the game insists it's pulled off. And, I can deal with gimmicky bosses in some games, but in a horror game, you've created one solution, so there's no agency, and you've created a very specific way to go about achieving that solution, so there's not really any fun either. See the second fight with the G-Mutant in the Resident Evil 2 remake. Get him over here.
Let's do this!
Well, fuck me, I guess. Probably the reason I'm never going to come back to that game is because of that boss fight. It's just frustrating. It takes you out of everything, and it's not fun, and it's not scary, and that's of course the worst that a boss fight can be in an aggressive horror game. But like I said, the best thing they can be is a resource sink. They can potentially make the rest of the game a little bit more tense because you're a lot tighter on resources as a result of having to fight them. But that's it. And there are other ways to drive tension that I think are a lot more interesting and a lot less forced. It's not like the players' decisions led them to lose those resources. The game's mechanics inherently led them to lose those resources. This was effectively a scripted theft of your ammo, right? Um, and passive horror doesn't really do boss fights, in my experience, but we'll get to that towards the end of the video. So far, we definitely have something of an even match. Passive horror is kind of a brighter burning candle that goes out faster, while aggressive horror manages to maintain the tension for a lot longer, though the scares themselves are not as intense. Of course, that is assuming that both games manage to immerse you, which aggressive horror has an easier time doing. So, the last broader category that I want to really look into with regard to passive versus aggressive horror is design priority. Just like how players are going to approach these games with a different mindset, devs tend to approach these subgenres with different priorities. For better or worse, some elements of each subgenre are tendencies of that subgenre, and other elements are inherent to the subgenre. They're things you can't really get away from. The first thing I want to talk about is ambiguous danger. We touched on this a little bit earlier, how generally speaking threats are going to be obvious. But passive horror, because it's so important that the danger is ambiguous, does a much better job, tends to go to a much greater effort to make the danger ambiguous. Not knowing whether you're in danger is the scariest that these games get. Midnight Walk has a very effective sequence where it's a trope that you see in passive horror very frequently, where you're sneaking by an enemy that is there, you can see it, but if you make too much noise, it's going to attack you. There's the lickers in Resident Evil, they're quite similar to that, but you see this a lot more in passive horror in particular, because it's an easier way to do enemy encounters without having to fight them. Of course, in Resident Evil, you can fight them. Some aggressive horror fighting isn't an option if you aggro these enemies, but it's very indicative of, the Midnight Walk kind of nails this trope in that the section where you're in, the enemies are called grinners, and you're in a big cave full of these things that you have to be very careful about how you move around. But not all of the grinner models in that cave are actually able to be aggroed. Some of them are just there. They're just models. And not knowing a lot of the time, having to kind of second guess yourself when you assume, oh, that one's not actually alive, I don't need to worry about that one. It's very effective, and it's indicative of how effective making threats ambiguous can be. And one thing that I remember particularly way back in the day when I first played SOMA was that the scariest parts of that game are the first 10 to 20 minutes after the intro, of course, where the game manages to hang in the air whether or not you're in danger, and it's really unclear in any given moment whether there's actually a threat nearby. As soon as the first threat, as soon as you get face to face with the first threat in SOMA, the game doesn't really reach the height that it was at before. The ambiguity of danger really can only last so long in passive horror, but the best thing they can do is delay that shoe from dropping for as long as possible. Now, of course, eventually that shoe has to drop, and unfortunately, a lot of the time in passive horror, the way it drops is with a forced chase. And the issue with forced chases is that they remove the ambiguity entirely from the best method of threat resolution. You know when running is your only option that it is the best option. There's no question about whether or not you're doing the thing that's most likely to ensure your survival with as little input as possible, with as few resources spent as possible. You need to question your decisions to be frightened, and a forced chase sequence eliminates those questions. And because passive horror is a lot more likely to do forced chase sequences, it tends to suffer in regard to the priority of the designers as far as scariness goes. Going back to that article from Thomas Grip, he says, a game can achieve a lot by combining agency with keeping things vague, and letting players decide to take uncertain decisions. Say that you are faced with a dark tunnel. Dark tunnels are pretty scary. Now imagine that the game explicitly tells you that your goal lies beyond the tunnel. There's no choice, you gotta go in. And if the game forces you to do something, it will also make sure you do actually have the means to complete this quest. He goes on to say, but what if entering this dark tunnel was voluntary, or at least presented as such? The game vaguely tells you that there might be something important there, but you don't know, and might also be certain death. All of a sudden, the tunnel feels a lot less safe. By adding agency and making entering the tunnel an uncertain choice, all sorts of doubts pop up in the player's mind, and those doubts are what is scary. And he's referring, of course, to more of an exploratory doubt, not knowing whether a certain route is worth going down, but the exact same logic applies to chase sequences. When running is your only option, like I said, when the game is telling you you have to do this, you know the game is giving you the resources you need to do it, and all of the tension is gone. But these diegetic chases, I talked about them a little bit with Midnight Walk, and of course diegetic is not quite the proper word to use, but it is a chase that is sort of naturally created by the player and within the environment of the game, rather than the game forcing the chase sequence onto the player. You see this more frequently in aggressive horror, right? Because in aggressive horror, the mindset that you have going around the game is not so much a crouch around very carefully mindset. You're going about this kind of gun drawn, ready to shoot things as a first response, and as a result, you tend to bumble into enemies a lot more frequently in aggressive horror, and if it's a group of enemies that you can't deal with or you don't want to deal with, you have created a chase sequence for yourself. It wasn't something that the designers made. Maybe they led you to do that, right? Maybe they put a bunch of zombies behind a door knowing that players are going to run away, but it doesn't feel like the game forced it on you, because realistically, if you have the means, you could fight that group of enemies. And this creates very scary moments that you see a lot more frequently in aggressive horror compared to passive horror. That's why I like that the Midnight Walk has these player-created chase sequences in it, because you don't really see that in passive horror very often. You give the player an unaffordable fight and they choose to run. You accidentally aggro a licker in Resident Evil 2 and it is terrifying. You can take the option to fight away as well in aggressive horror. You have to be careful about that, but it is an option. You can create a sequence where the player can't use their weapons anymore. You can create a sequence where for one reason or another combat is not an option. This has varying effects in how you go about it, in the priority of the designers when they create these sequences. The Silent Hill 2 hotel basement, I think, is much scarier than the Resident Evil 2 orphanage sequence, because in the hotel basement, you're still playing as James, right? You just had to put all your weapons away before you went down there. So you can still take damage. The game hasn't given you any reason to believe that you are safe now that you don't have your weapons. In Resident Evil 2, you play as an actual child. And maybe I shouldn't have assumed this, but I kind of figured the game wasn't really going to make combat happen when you're playing as Sherry. It seems so implausible from jump that you kind of know, okay, well we're in walking simulator mode now then. Combat's off the table. I'm chill, right? I'm a lot more relaxed playing as Sherry in the non-combat section in Resident Evil 2 than I was playing as James when I just had my weapons taken away. So the priority of the designers when creating these sequences definitely comes into play and how effective they are. Forced chases in aggressive horror are usually action set pieces. where in passive horror it's just kind of how chase sequences tend to work. In aggressive horror, it's usually because they're trying to make it a very action-packed game. See the alligator chase in Resident Evil 2, and when early on when you get into the sewers, it's not scary. It's Oh, I'm going. Okay. So, is this a cutscene? Do I have control? Yeah, I do. Okay. I mean, oh, and I can't pause either. Oh, and you can actually just die. Well, that was really fucking lame. I don't know, it's a set piece. It's an action scene. And that is something where the design priority with aggressive horror tends to fall flat, because they tend to be very obsessed with combat, where combat realistically should be a last resort. A lot of aggressive horror, particularly the Resident Evil franchise, makes combat very much a focal point. And they tend to get these systems, the combat and the resource management, just the action of it all, tends to take priority over the actual horror, and it results in a much less scary experience. Signalis has excellent combat and resource management because mechanically it is a shooter first and a survival horror game second. It's a fantastic system they put together. It's a fun game when you're shooting enemies, but it's not scary. You feel a little too powerful to be scary. Continuing with that Thomas Grip article, let's use Dead Space as an example. When I started playing it, I was really scared, walking around slowly and peeking around every corner. Then, about an hour in, I learned how to kill the monsters and what tricks I needed to survive. Not only did I get good at killing the monsters, I thought it was great fun. The things that used to terrify me now became a source of amusement. Instead of dreading the monster sounds, they now made me excited. Oh, great, another necromorph to dismember. So where did the fear go? It was simply overshadowed by rewarding gameplay. Thomas Grip makes this point better than I possibly could have. These games end up, aggressive horror tends to end up being too fun and creating too much of a power fantasy to be scary. By around the midpoint, especially with Dead Space, though, you see this towards the end of a Resident Evil 2 playthrough, and you see this towards the end of the Signalis playthrough, you feel competent enough with the combat system that your contingency plan, your plan B, suddenly becomes your kind of default, right? You're not shying away from combat anymore, you're kind of looking forward to it. And that really does put it successfully into words, I think, how the devs of aggressive horror do very much tend to prioritize the action above the horror. It's not always the case. Some games do a much better job than others, but it is still something you see a lot of. And I think it works very much in favor of passive horror that any sort of confrontation is shied away from in those sort of games. So, before we start to wrap things up here, I want to summarize a research article that I found very early on in the process of researching for this video, called Fight Not Flight, which detailed an experiment created in 2024 by Natsuki Sakamoto and Hideyuki Tanaka from Tokyo University. Hopefully I'm at least getting close with those pronunciations. And effectively what they were studying was whether being in fight mode versus flight mode affected your attentional biases while you were anxious. And what they did was they took 36 university students and randomly divided them into a hit group and an avoid group. And we'll talk in a second about what that actually means. In the experiment, each participant was put in a room, and in front of them were 3 buttons, left, center, and right, and a 27-inch screen in front of them. And in the first section of the trial, you would see on the screen two faces on the left and on the right. One of the faces was either happy or angry, and one of the faces was neutral. All of this was randomized, whether or not it was happy versus neutral or angry versus neutral, and which side which face ended up on the screen. The second phase, those faces went away from the screen, and on the screen in their place was a probe in the shape of a human silhouette, either on the left side or the right side. The people in the hit group were instructed to press the button corresponding to the side of the screen on which the probe was, and the people in the avoid group were instructed to do the opposite, that is, press the button corresponding to the side of the screen where the probe was not. The center button was just there for them to keep their index finger on until the probe appeared, at which point they could release it and select one or the other. They had 40 practice trials to get used to this process, and then there were 6 blocks of 40 test trials each. Now in blocks 1, 3, and 5, everything went as I just described, but in blocks 2, 4, and 6, the participants were made aware at the beginning that this block had the threat of a shock. The shocks were calibrated for each participant to be quite unpleasant but not painful, so they knew what they were getting themselves into going in, and ultimately there were only 2 shocks administered, one towards the beginning of the first threat block, one towards the end of the second threat block, and then none in the third threat block. So with the trials concluded, the researchers now had 240 response times for each participant. They took these times and averaged them within 2 categories. Emotional cue categories, that is to say, whether the faces presented were happy and neutral or angry and neutral, and whether or not there was a threat of shock during that trial. They took all those results and compared them between the the hit group and the avoid group. They also, in the process of looking at all this data, created a new variable that they refer to as an attentional bias index, which was calculated based on participant response times compared to what they call probe threat congruence. And what that essentially means is if the probe in the second phase of the trial came up over on the corresponding side to where the threat was, a threat either being a neutral face compared to a happy face or an angry face compared to a neutral face, that is threat congruence, if the probe shows up where that threat was. And effectively, this attentional bias index is a variable that informs the level of focus on threats. And it's not, of course, there's a reason it's put this explicitly, right? There's the objective nature of this sort of research demands that it be made that explicit. I personally, for the purposes of this video essay, would posit that if you are more focused, if you are more preoccupied with threats, it indicates that you are more afraid. If the threat that you perceive is the main thing, drawing the main focus in your mind, I think that is a good indicator that you are afraid. Now, what they found during this trial was that the participants in the hit group, that is, the people who had to press the button that corresponded to the probe in situations where the probe was corresponding to the threat, the neutral versus the happy face, or the angry versus the neutral face, the people in hit mode were not affected by the threat of shock. So their level of anxiety did not seem to impact whether they were more or less focused on the perceived threats. Whereas the people in avoid mode had their focus on threats significantly changed by a threat of shock. So in situations where anxiety has been guaranteed, it seems this study would suggest that you are going to be more preoccupied with threats when you are in a state of mind where you are trying to avoid threats than when you are trying to hit threats. And it's very compelling, right, for the purposes of this video essay. The trouble, of course, it's worth mentioning if I'm going to use this to support my arguments, It's 32 Tokyo University students. 4 of them cheated. Uh, Apparently, what they did was they developed strategies. I'm sure it was subconscious, but there was a strategy perceived after looking at the data where these participants would preemptively remove their finger from the middle button to press faster, and so they had to throw that data out. But it's 32 Tokyo University students. Not a very diverse, well, likely not a particularly diverse sample size, and not a very big sample size to begin with. I'd be very interested to see this experiment done on a larger scale. But in case my sort of excited rambling about this is not quite coherent, to put it in the words of the researchers themselves, it is intriguing that healthy individuals exhibited disengagement difficulties when experiencing heightened state anxiety in the avoidant action mode, but not when in the hit action mode. This distinction between the action modes may stem from the interplay between action goals and corresponding mindsets. In this study, the avoidant action, while itself only a task goal, corresponded to flight behavior in response to threat-related stimulus cues in threat-congruent trials. As anxiety was heightened via threat of shock, this flight-like behavior may have unconsciously reinforced a threat mindset rather than a challenge mindset, as suggested by the embodied cognition framework. Adopting a threat mindset may increase one's vulnerability to anxiety. This heightened vulnerability may impair attentional flexibility by leading one to prioritize threat stimuli over other task-relevant targets. Now, what's really interesting is that Thomas Grip, in that same article I've been referencing throughout the video, seems to have arrived at kind of the same conclusion, despite his experience in producing fear in individuals being much different from the scientists' experience. He says, us humans tend to have this thing called attention, and we only have a limited amount of it. If the game is constantly engaging the player with thinking about their aim, checking ammo, and looking for loot, there's no room left for much else. In other words, the player's brain will lack resources to frighten themselves. And like I said, I found that research article, Fight Not Flight, very early on in the process of making this video. And it really felt like a smoking gun. It felt like, well, there you go. Inherently, passive horror is scarier. And then to see Thomas Grip effectively confirm that makes it all the more compelling. But I don't know if I can, in good conscience, avoid all of the benefits, all of the merits that aggressive horror has. That ease of immersion, most notably, but also the stronger tendency towards these more natural feeling chase sequences, the inherent increase of agency in the way you approach these games. And I think it's interesting that the article, 9 Years, 9 Lessons from Thomas Grip, was published in October of 2019. Then a year later, Amnesia Rebirth comes out, October of 2020. And Amnesia Rebirth, if you don't know, was quite frequently maligned for being more than anything a walking simulator. It makes me wonder if maybe now, 15 years later, are there perhaps a few more lessons on horror from Thomas Grip? Because in 2023, Amnesia the Bunker was released. And I think that Amnesia the Bunker represents the perfect blend between aggressive and passive horror. So, towards the end of the process of making this video, I was sorting all of my notes on each game into categories. This point works in favor of aggressive horror. This point works in favor of passive horror. This game is objectively aggressive. This game is objectively passive. And I made a point to save my notes for Amnesia the Bunker for the end of this process. So, because I got the impression while I was playing Amnesia the Bunker that for one reason or another, it was the scariest experience I have had in gaming. That flat out. I'm happy to say that. It's probably the scariest game I've ever played. But when I set to categorizing it, I really couldn't bring myself to categorize it as passive horror. As much as I wanted to, as happy as I was to have that feather in the cap of that subgenre, it's not quite passive horror. You can shoot the enemies in Amnesia the Bunker. You can shoot the rats, you can burn the rats, you can shoot the monster, you can burn the monster. There is, objectively, combat in Amnesia the Bunker. It's not quite like any other combat I've ever experienced in a horror game, but there is combat, and I couldn't in good faith make the argument that it is a strictly passive horror game. Like I said, it is a blend between the genres. It has Resident Evil's inventory system, effectively. The inventory you have in the box that you store the bulk of your things in is also limited. But the inventory in general is a lot more limited in Amnesia the Bunker, and I think that works to its benefit quite a bit. It's also got a simpler inventory system in general. There are fewer, a smaller variety of items to pick up in Amnesia the Bunker compared to Resident Evil games, but it effectively takes the same system and puts it into a much more passive horror game. There's weaponized ambiguity in every single decision that you make in Amnesia the Bunker. Combat adds just one more option to encounters, and it's not the most desirable option a lot of the time. Bullets are so very limited in Amnesia the Bunker that more often than not, you would much rather hide from the monster and wait it out than directly confront it and have to shoot it. That is very much a last resort. Any real combative action is going to make a lot of noise and bring that monster down on you, forcing you to use more resources, potentially get hurt, which makes any type of combative action come with quite the asterisk as to whether or not it's the best bet at any given moment. Even charging your flashlight in the bunker can lead to confrontation. You have to think twice about giving yourself the ability to see. The resource management in general is creating constant tension there. Like I said, bullets are extremely limited, but there's also a fuel system, or if you want to keep most of the lights in the bunker on, you have to keep coming back to the generator in like the center of the bunker and refill it. And it's so effective. And I think a lot more games need to take that approach to horror, because it's not either. It's not quite passive. It's not quite aggressive. It is kind of its own thing. And it really is indicative of the fact that there isn't really a perfect answer. And there isn't really a perfect answer to which one of these is inherently scarier. And the best thing you can do is blend the genres together. Because, I mean, the other really interesting thing about Amnesia the Bunker, I said very emphatically that boss fights are inherently unscary just like 2 sections ago. But Amnesia the Bunker manages to create kind of a boss fight towards the end that is actually quite scary. It's this interesting kind of maze lever puzzle where you have to close off and open off routes to get to the end, while also making sure when you get to the end you have enough distance between yourself and the beast to do the next little thing that you need to do to get away from it. And then that leads to effectively the end of the game. And it's really interesting because this whole time you're trying to keep that monster a certain distance away from you, but you have opportunities to look at it from across the room for the whole section. It's really, really good tension. You have to keep the horror in your line of sight, where before you've been avoiding it this whole time, and you're still problem solving, and there's a lot of ambiguity in how you create the best route to get to the end while also keeping the monster far enough back to give you enough time. It's fantastic. I didn't want this video to effectively be Amnesia the Bunker glazing video, but it is the answer to the question that I've been asking myself all year. It's not about fight versus flight. It's about fighting and fleeing. It's about blending those together in such a way that makes you always wonder what's the best way forward. I think I can speak for most people when I say that in 2025, I was, more than anything, looking to be distracted by the media I consumed. I wanted to be immersed in a world into which I could escape for a few hours here and there, letting myself forget the challenges faced by the world around me. I don't want to speak too explicitly on why this is, because it's probably not what I want this channel to be about, and it's definitely not what I want this video to be about, but suffice it to say, I can't help but perceive a certain deep-seated anxiety in most facets of my society over the past 10 months. Horror games, in addition to providing the most engaging sort of escapism that fear-driven immersion creates, provide to your subconscious a tangible threat to be afraid of in an ultimately safe setting. I can't speak for everyone, but I think being scared the way a horror game, really the way horror media in general, makes me, helps me to process the less tangible threats my phone tells me about on an hourly basis that I'm largely powerless to resolve. It runs me through that emotional loop in a way that doesn't let anxiety fester in my subconscious, because sooner or later, the threats in a horror game go away. They are safe places to process those feelings. When I realized this, I started chasing that sensation of primal fear that a horror game gives you, when the character you're playing is in danger and you need to make a decision as to how to keep them safe. I'd been playing horror games so regularly for so long that most of the other tactics these games used to scare me fell flat, and I felt compelled to get to the bottom of what really drives that fear and what mechanics help facilitate it. We've been over, of course, the conclusions I came to regarding fight versus flight, passive versus aggressive horror, that I think the best a game can do is blend these subgenres, providing combat as an option, but making it undesirable, unsustainable, and temporary in an effort to further complicate the player's options and make the choices between them harder. But I think the deeper point I've arrived at is that in a world where we have so little agency to overcome anxiety driven by its nature, a well-executed, interactive horror experience can help us to work through those feelings without risk, and make us better able to handle those feelings during their inevitable encounters throughout our lives. I'm not saying anyone should use these games to run away from their problems at every turn, and of course, if you are genuinely struggling with anxiety, please don't consider this medical advice, but if you find time for an escape, maybe a horror game, especially one that follows the tenets laid out in this video, would be the perfect way to unwind. Well, this is nice. Oh. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks for watching in general, but if you made it to this, thank you in particular. It kind of goes without saying, but it also feels really weird not to acknowledge it. This is the first video on this channel. I've been trying to make content on the internet for long enough to know better than to try and promise any sort of consistency as far as upload schedules go. But I mean, on that note, if you do want to see more from me, twitch.tv/jackofalltrades. I did all of the I did all the research that I could on this for this video over there. I also upload the VODs themselves to YouTube. I don't actually know the URL. I'd love to believe it's youtube.com/jackofalltrades, but I doubt it. Not this channel, of course. It's a Twitch VOD channel, and then there's some old Let's Plays from when I was a teenager on there as well. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. It's been a lot of fun. I'm going to get to editing this and hopefully have it out before Halloween. I like my chances, but yeah. I definitely went for a semi-improvisational tone with this one. I don't know if that's going to be the case in future video essays, but I hope you liked it. And if you didn't, well, it's the first one. I really hope there's a lot more to come from here. So